So I just kind of outlined what I imagine we might do, but just to kind of set this up, you guys are welcome, because I know that you're here for very specific reasons. So the way that I explain some of this stuff, you might need additional explaining, you might have other questions. I will do my best to answer your questions, but please feel free to just interrupt at any time and ask additional questions. Yes? Email. Yes, definitely.
I don't know if we have that.
Yeah, I haven't put on my, yeah, sure. So my email is M for Marion, Cadora, CADORA, at hawaii.edu. Hawaii, HAWAII.edu. Okay, and M Cadora. Yeah.
CADORA?
Yes, yes. Yeah, and I come from the land of resources at University of Hawaii, which I'm really, in terms of Pacific material. So I'm really lucky to work with different colleagues who know some of this material in quite a bit of depth. We also have our friends from P&G who can maybe even chime in on some of the P&G images. So do feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to share. Most of the images that I have in my PowerPoint, most of them are, a few of them are scanned from books, but a lot of them are from the internet and from museum websites. So for Pacific material, I would say some of the most reliable resources are on museums. So the British Museum is a great source. The Metropolitan Museum is a great source. What else? Those are kind of the two main ones that I generally use. Australia also has numerous museums that have really very clean images and sometimes videos about some of the work. Okay, so I wanted to just spend some time and introduce the Pacific, the region geographically, but also some historical points that you guys should know when you're teaching the Pacific. So I'll probably spend 15 or 20 minutes on that. And then 60 to 80 minutes, maybe less, maybe more, depending on what you need, just explaining the content images. And then I also included some comparisons. So as we're going through some of the images too, maybe keep in mind some possible comparisons. I think that just talking with Cheryl too, I think this is kind of a crucial thing to think about when we're talking about the Pacific, because some of these ideas are so will be so new to students and to you as well, that we should kind of try to work out some of the issues that are relevant to compare. So I came up with sort of a rough list of comparisons that I'll go over. Yes,
so it's
no problem.
6,
yes.
We're supposed to be done at 7:30.
Yep.
So we're looking at 1 hour and 45 minutes.
Okay, I can do that. Okay, so also I wanted to just mention University of Hawaii. One of the big issues with the Pacific, contemporary issues, is misrepresentation. So the Pacific is a colonized region. Colonization, post-colonialism is a really, really major issue in the Pacific. And so as teachers, you actually have a really big role in terms of representing a culture. So there's different, and I'm going to go into some specific issues of how representation has been very ingrained in some of these communities. But, oh, I forgot, I have to change my slide on here. There we go. Okay, there we go. So Bill Stoney Herenico, who is a scholar at University of Hawaii, he talks a lot about representational issues. So he says a stereotypical culture identity once stuck is almost impossible to shake off completely. When we frame the Pacific, often we frame it as a culture of the past, a culture that does not exist. but is very much, and we can get some experiences also from our friends from PNG, that this is very much a living and breathing cultures. The objects that we're even looking at, the objects that we looked at today, they are believed to be living and breathing entities that have a lot of mana, and I'll go over that term throughout the class period, that these are not artifacts. They are treasures, they're cultural treasures that are speaking and very much ingrained in Pacific philosophies of life and of space and aesthetics. So just keep that in mind. This is an image from a very famous film called Cannibal Tours. So if any of you have the anthropology background, tourists, European tourists that go into PNG that have a particular way of looking at objects and their experiences that are sort of ingrained in this notion of primitivism, and bringing those stories back home and spreading this idea of primitivism. So these are some ideas that we really, when we're teaching art history, we also want to debunk some of these stereotypes about history. And I know for what you guys need to do, you have to think about this test. But also, if you can also incorporate these ideas that also help empower communities as well, it's very important for the Pacific as a whole. Okay, so for some reason there's this little blotch right here. I don't know why, but if that becomes an issue, we'll try to figure it out. This is a map of the Pacific. So we are going to be talking about the region of Melanesia, Micronesia, and I'll show you another map that distinguishes it, and Polynesia. Now, the cool thing about the Pacific is that when we move from left to right, we're almost moving from an older culture to a newer culture. And I'll explain that in detail. But the region itself, where's the other map? Hold on. Oh, here we go. Okay, the region itself is divided by Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. So Melanesia, it comes from the word black. Micronesia comes from the word small, micro. Poly means many. So this is a term that has been, these terms that have been implied since colonialism. And it's a process of naming. And again, this, it was actually a French voyager that had named these different regions, Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. Now, this also comes into play with this idea of representing a nation. So what the initial explorers had found in this region is that Melanesia, there's many black people who live in Melanesia. So thus, they called that region Melanesia. Micronesia, they noticed that there's lots of little atolls, lots of little islands. Thus, they called that region Micronesia. And then Polynesia, the same kind of idea, many islands. So before this sort of coining of these regions, the islands themselves, the cultures themselves, didn't necessarily identify themselves within that term. So an example of that might be Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. So between Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, there's a lot of trading that has gone on in terms of shared traditions, shared material culture traditions. But yet, Fiji is classified as Melanesia. So there's some things that really don't work very well in terms of this classification. But there's some things that actually do work well. Because what we see going on in Melanesia, there's some cultural traits that they do have some commonalities. And I'll go into detail about some of those ideas. Okay, wait, let me just make sure. Okay, so the Lapita. This is something that I will bring up probably numerous times. This is a term that you should know in introducing the Pacific. Lapita cultures. Let me get to the slide. Lapita cultures began migration. So there's basically 3 phases of migration in the Pacific. So we start with the first phase, which basically is covering Australia, Papua New Guinea, and then some of the Melanesian cultures. And then as the years go on, people start migrating farther east and south and also north. So just to kind of introduce, I'm just going to go back to this image. Sorry, I have them out of order. So this pottery, a piece of pottery, is an example from Lapita. So we can see these very simple geometrical designs around the rims and then circular designs. And this is really the foundation of many designs that we see throughout the Pacific. And it can actually be traced. So when I'm in Hawaii, often people say they refer to other Pacific peoples as their cousins, because they actually are cousins if you trace the migration. So just to kind of introduce some of these phases of migration. So the first phase in Oceania is 2000 to 1000 BCE. And what we see happening, most of the interactions and cultural productions are happening in Australia and also Papua New Guinea. During this period, you see the X-ray cave paintings, and I'll show an example of that. And then some of the earliest stone sculptures in New Guinea also start to be developed during this time. Migration to Palau and the Mariana Islands, so people start migrating. And then Lapita reaches as far as Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa during this period as well. So just to kind of give examples of things that have been found during the Lapita culture. This is an example of the lakatoi. This is a sailboat that was mainly used in the islands of PNG. You can see the way that the sails are shaped. So this is a typical sailing vessel. It's also important to note that within the Pacific, we often think of the ocean as something that separates us. But for Pacific Islanders, it's believed that the ocean connects people. So sailing, and we'll go through different traditions of sailing, is very much ingrained. The sea, the philosophies of the sea are very much ingrained in the way that people understand the world and also the universe. So just an example of that. This is an example of the X-ray cave paintings, and you can see that this particular figure has something on their head, and I don't know if anybody can recognize it. Maybe you guys. Good. Yeah. No, it was the Bilum bag. Bilum bag. So the Bilum bag is that old. It's an amazing cultural product of PNG. BILUM.
So where are you seeing the Bilum bag? Are you seeing
Oh,
it on like the end?
on the head. Attached to the head.
Oh, I see.
It's been
So
identified as a
holes in
Bilum.
the-
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How do we know?
Yeah, that's okay.
How do we know? Do we have writing, or do we just have oral tradition at this point to tell us is a Bilum, that's a Bilum bag?
It's a really good question. I mean, this goes down to, do you guys have any comments about that? No. Okay, so this is visual inquiry. So it could be interpreted, it could be interpreted as antlers, it could be interpreted as a bill and bag. So it's basically visual analysis of these objects. The resource that I got that image from identifies it as a bilum. So a series of, and I guess there's other paintings as well that there's bilums that are also identified in there. But I think that's a really good question in terms of kind of understanding what we're looking at, because we're also coming in with our own kind of understanding of what that image is. But of course, these are produced thousands and thousands of years ago. Yeah.
Can I, just in addition to that, by looking at the demonstration of a picture, normally Melanesian, Micronesian, and Polynesian, if it is a bilum is meant for women on the side. The papillum hanging from the head is a bilum.
Yeah, good. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so, yes. And I don't have any pictures of that, but yes, so bilums would be carried on their head so that the weight of it goes on the back.
So that just further reinforces that.
Yeah.
So that bag that you have, you would put something in it and then put the straps on your forehead?
Well, this one is actually a different style. So, I mean, sometimes you might see people wearing it like that.
This one is from the coastal area.
Yeah.
And this is meant for us to put it on the side.
On the side.
But that one has a long handle supposed to come at it like this. I'll demonstrate it.
And when you go to PNG, you'll see, this is a very common scene that you see.
The weight will fall on the back. That's the reason.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Just adding on that, the coastal people. This is a bilum of a coastal. The one that was on the PowerPoint there, it's of an island. That's an interior part where women mainly put them at the head and they carry them at the back. The ones that are carried on the side of the hips, like the small one, mainly comes from the coastal people.
Yeah, so there's hundreds of variations of bilums. Unfortunately, bilum is not on your list. I wish it was, because it's really amazing. It is an amazing bag to talk about in many different ways. Okay, so just keeping on track. This is another example of a bilum, an older style. Each style of bilum has a different name depending on its use and depending on where it comes from, and also depending on the types of materials that are used. These are just examples of some of the early stone sculptures that were found in the highlands. We can see shapes of a bird, also possibly another bird. And yeah, I think these are from, some of them are from also found in Enga. Cassowary bird. And so just the connections between animals, birds. So what we see in sculptures is also still very much lived and breathed today. So this is an example, image of Chimbu performers at one of the festivals wearing the feathers of the birds. And we're going to go into a little bit more connections of some of the ceremonies and the power that is attained from birds and the connection of featherwork in the Pacific as well. Okay, these are just a few examples of different regions. I wish we could spend more time talking about it, but unfortunately, not a huge amount of time right now. Okay, so the second phase is basically sort of the pinnacle of Lapita production. So this is when we start finding a lot of the pottery that is found. And examples such as also new tools, so harder tools which allowed for communities to be more productive in terms of hunting and this sort of thing. So more technology. So again, these kinds of pottery, pieces of pottery that were found, and we're going to see how these designs, and even if we think back into the experience in the gallery, that these geometrical designs are very common and very well known in different forms. So, but it's really, its grounding foundation is through this Lapita culture and Lapita migration. And we can connect some of those designs into Tapa. So these are early examples of Tapa. So different squares separating the space, and then geometrical designs throughout the patterns.
What was the function of these?
Okay, we're gonna go into that. So I'm just introducing some of these, just to kind of place it within Lapita migration. This is another example. Okay, and then the final stage of migration is, so Micronesian people inhabit Chuuk and the Caroline Islands, and then 300 to 600 AD, Polynesian people settle in Hawaii, Easter Islands, and the Marquesan Islands. Also in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Hawaii, Easter Islands, and Aotearoa are, I'm saying Aotearoa. Aotearoa is the indigenous name for New Zealand. So when you're in the Pacific, you'll hear people say Aotearoa and not New Zealand. So that may come out. I'll try to clarify it when that comes up. So these are the final the final islands that were inhabited. Okay, so just to recap, we moved from, in terms of migration, earliest migration in Melanesia. Then we started moving southeast to Tonga, Fiji, Samoa. And then the final stage of migration, Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand down here. Okay, so, and we're just to keep that in mind in terms of when we're looking at some of the examples. Okay, so I'm gonna, the rest of the lecture, I'm gonna be talking about these different regions and organizing it via these larger segregations on the map. So Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Does anyone have questions about that thus far? Does that make sense in terms of these regional divisions?
It does a little, but like I don't even know, I mean, the Lapita, which you've used
Yes.
lots of times, they are the original peoples, and now Hawaiians would consider their ancestry Lapita.
Yes,
And New Zealanders would consider their ancestors Lapita.
exactly. So
Okay.
these are the earliest, okay, good question. So these are the early, it's considered the early migration within the islands. And then once they have settled in their particular islands, cultural specificities start to emerge. And that's what we're going to be looking at, yes.
The early map you had showed the Philippines as one of the places that was kind of in that Micronesia
Yeah.
gray zone.
Mhm.
Is that one of those that was settled and anthropologically?
Yeah.
Do we know, like, if that was a place that was settled and then has mixed and mingled and all kinds of stuff? Because I saw it on the beginning
Yep.
there, and I haven't really
Seen it. Okay, so we're not going over the Philippines. The Philippines, Taiwan, these are, again, these are kind of very intricate archaeological theories that are being developed in terms of where they're placed, how far does Lapita culture move during this
We're not
period.
sure what
There's some people who probably think that for sure it has. Some of the Pacific conferences now, they always incorporate the indigenous Taiwanese communities into the Pacific art conferences. So, but this is kind of a new thing. So it's all based off of archaeological evidence. So it's not as commonly known. So and this goes back to how are we even developing this information? It's based off of what archaeologists have found and have written and have produced and for other historians to kind of rely on. So it's a really, really good question. For the sake of, and that might be a really good thing to mention too, that when we're talking about Pacific cousins, it possibly does reach into Taiwan, for example. But then, of course, Taiwan was colonized by the Chinese. So, and they're the dominant sort of culture. Indigenous cultures generally, you know, have a lot of things that they have to fight for. So, something to consider, yes.
This may be weird, but how do you account for all the variations in the language? Is that part of where you say that the settlements start to culturally become more diverse or unique?
Right.
But did they ever once start with one language and then?
It's a good question. I wish I could give you a very thorough answer if I was a linguistics person. But yes. Papua New Guinea, for example, has 800 different languages.
Are you serious? And that's where I'm like,
Yes.
does that come out of this migration that somehow everything's just spreading?
Yeah. So, and there's different phases of migration too that we have to consider. In PNG, if you go there and you go to the highlands, you realize how drastic and diverse the environments are. So in the highlands, where they're from, it's very difficult to move from one community to the next without an airplane. Some of them are, I mean, it would take a very long time to move from one community. And so you can kind of understand how totally different languages have been formed.
Really isolated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mainly the spread of the Lapita poetry is a fact in relation to, there is a as you have said, is different phases or different groups of migrations that took place from Southeast Asia. The first migration took place about 50,000 years ago. And then after that, 20,000 years ago, there's another series of migrations. And then the different two groups of language, we call them Austronesians and non-Austronesian speaking people arrived. The Austronesians speaking group of people, they migrated to the coastal areas, and then they settled around the Pacific and Micronesia, Polynesia, and all. And the non-Austronesian speakers are the ones who migrated to the interior part of Papua New Guinea, and some who migrated down to Australia, the Australian continent, where the continent was joined together by ice and snow. And they crossed those land bridge called Saul and Sunda. That's during 50,000 years ago when people came to settle in the Pacific and in the islands of New Guinea. And two different major language groups arrived. Mm-hmm. That is Austronesian and non-Austronesian. Mm-hmm.
They even mentioned that land bridge in this beginning stuff.
Oh, yes.
Somewhere. I didn't understand what I was reading, but
Right.
that helps.
Okay, good, excellent. And then also, as we sort of trace the migration of culture and people and languages, we find that there's a lot of commonalities, especially in Micronesia. You'll find that they use similar words for the same kind of object or the same thing or same concept, and then same with Polynesia. So my experience in Hawaii is Maori and Hawaiians, when they get together, they're constantly exchanging, like, oh, what do you say for this word? What do you say? And they're very, very similar. And that goes back to this period of migration that they were once inhabiting the same region and then split off and moved to different areas of the Pacific, but still with that foundation, right? So as they start inhabiting different islands, their culture becomes more specific and more developed. And we're going to see how a lot of these shared ideas are really evident in some of the artwork as well. Okay, excellent. Any other questions about that? Okay, so I'm going to jump into the actual images. So please feel free to ask any questions. And if I cannot answer them, I'll jot down the question and I'll try to get back to you guys about that. Okay, so we're looking primarily for our first image, Melanesia, and specifically Papua New Guinea. And so these are some kind of common themes that we might find in Papua New Guinea. So symbols of potent supernatural beings. And thinking back to the gallery as well, these are some things that we even saw in the gallery today. Men versus women in ceremony and religion. Now, this is a really complicated topic of gender that will be distinguished depending on where you are. But generally, men and women have different roles. So for example, a bill and bag would only be produced by a female, whereas some of the carvings would only be produced by a male. There is one theory that sort of describes and distinguishes men versus female as the women. Women are associated with the concept of being wet, so a soft skin, so thus a soft skin. Men are associated with sort of a harder skin, thus carving. But this can go back to really intricate and complex kind of gender roles within these communities. And what we see commonly, and what you'll see in this section of the content list, are sculptures that are part of life cycle rites, ceremonies, or hunting. So they play a very important role in the duties of the male role in communities. Often what we see in Melanesia is a ceremonial house that is the center of a community. So these are egalitarian societies, which we won't see throughout the Pacific, but depending on your activities throughout your life as a man, you can achieve more power in a community. And we don't see that in Polynesia. So it's one thing that is really distinguishable about some of the Melanesian traditions. So some of the representations that we might see that are really typical, but again, very specific depending on where we're looking at, are representations of the supernatural, ancestors, animals, domestic animals that might be inhabiting that region, plants, and also composite figures. So the Malagan figure that we looked at is an example of a composite figure. Okay, so the Malagan figures come from New Ireland. And so this is a map of Papua New Guinea. So again, Australia is down here. PNG is up here. This is West Papua. Right now it's colonized by Indonesia. A lot of the things that we saw today actually come from this region. Very big political human rights issues going on in West Papua that I won't get into, but just so you know that they are culturally they are of the same heritage. So thus we would see a lot of similarities in terms of shared traditions. But what we're looking at mainly is New Ireland, the small island up here. Okay, so this is image 222. So I just copied and pasted this from the, I think, Khan Academy, just so we all are on the same page in terms of what we're looking at. Just pull this up. Okay, so this is the image that is on the list. And what you're looking at is a Malagan display. So it's sort of set up like a stage. In this instance, there are, I think, 12 figures in here. And if you take a close look, you'll see that each figure is similar, some similar styles, some similar traits, but very different at the same time. So with the Malagan figures, you'll never see a figure that is identical to the other one. Yes?
You said set up like a stage.
Yes.
Would you also say set up like a frieze or not?
No,
a stage.
Well, a frieze would be, so this is another picture. So it's almost in a sort of a sheltered space. Now this is what our book gives us. There may be other instances. And I have been to New Ireland a couple times, and this is kind of exactly what I had saw too, where it's a sheltered space where the figures are just exhibited, basically. Okay, so the Malagan figures are visually classified as being very complex. They're described as being totemic and cosmic relations with clan identities. There's a wide variety of figures that come from the Malagan tradition. We're going to be looking at two examples, and they're used primarily in just in general in feasts, dances, and displayed like this in exhibited in a house, just as we see in this image. So just in general, when we're looking at them, we see how complex they are. Composite forms, so multiple figures. You might see sea creatures, you might see a figure of a man, you might see a bird, and in this instance we see faces, human faces, not meant to represent a specific person, but to embody the spirit of the dead, of a specific person, but again, not representing that person. Yes.
Is the person dead before the image is created?
Okay, so I will explain that.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for, and yes, please ask any questions that do not make sense. Okay, so just to kind of explain, well, actually, maybe I should explain first. Okay, let me move to this image. Okay, so the Malagan ceremony is a very complex society and also ritual. So basically, when a person dies, the most important thing is to destroy all of his possessions. In New Ireland, in northern New Ireland, where the Malagan tradition exists, the garden, his garden, so his vegetable garden, is an extension of that person, of his personhood, of his life. It's reflective of who he is. And I know that you could probably talk about gardens quite a bit, but specifically, just for what you guys need to know is that the garden is a really important part of his physical presence on earth. So when a person dies, all of his possessions have to be destroyed. So in the house, his garden. Somebody from his clan would dress up as a bush spirit and then go and destroy all of his things. This begins the Malagan, the end cycle of the Malagan ceremony. So from that point on, the clan member would go into seclusion, and they could be in seclusion for a month, 2 months, 3 months. Yes. And he goes into this phase of the dreaming cycle. And this is where the images are then envisioned for the Malagan figure. Okay, so that's why when we're looking at them, we don't necessarily see, we might see similar types of images, but we won't see anything identical. And I'll go into some examples of what they look like as well. During the dreaming process or the seclusion? It depends. Yeah, so it could be 2 months, it could be 6 months. So it really depends on that. Yep. Yes.
Male and female, or
Men.
Just
By now, and they destroy
The house.
all the house
Yeah.
What about if there are family members left?
before their seclusion, right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry?
Before the seclusion.
Of the person who does the destroying.
Yeah, before seclusion. Yeah, and so
That's
that.
a good question. What about where's the family go?
That's a good question. I think that they might build a new house. And traditions have changed too. I mean, you won't see this today. Malagan traditions do exist today, but the way in which they're enacted, and maybe you guys could speak on that issue too in terms of, do you guys know much about Malagan? No?
I
Just,
I mean, just to help you out.
yeah,
What you said is true.
yeah, okay.
Because some of the properties like clothes and houses that a person who has died lives are sometimes destroyed. Maybe their food gardens, their clothes, and some objects that particularly that he personally owns,
Yeah.
not the things that our family owns. But these personal properties or gardens are destroyed because they expect that his spirit might come back.
Yeah. And
To get those possessions.
yes.
Prevent the spirit from not coming back.
Yeah.
No, it is to help the spirit move to the next world.
Next world.
Yeah. So it's not. It's to help the spirit. So, and also, you can think about other cultures that you guys also teach in terms of this idea of what happens to the spirit after they die, right? So this is sort of a manifestation of that.
Well, some cultures believe that the lingering spirit can do evil. So is that
Right.
part of it, just to usher them so that
Well, it's not that the spirit is evil, but it would be a reflection. It's so that society can be regenerated. It can be a healthy society. So it's not that they're necessarily afraid of that spirit, but it's so that the Malagan communities can, be able to regenerate and kind of move on, sort of thing. Oh, I actually don't know. Do you know? Well, see, this is another thing that's changing because most Pacific communities in PNG are Christian. So cremation, most bodies would be buried today. Yeah.
Who creates the Malagan figure?
So it would be a clan member of the deceased.
Not the person who did the destroying.
Yes, the person who destroyed. Yeah.
So it'd be created for the spirit of the person who died, but then it would be destroyed so the spirit could move on.
Wait, say that again? I'm sorry.
So the Malagan mask is
Yeah.
going to be created for the spirit
Yes.
of the person who has died.
Yes,
And then it will be destroyed along with everything else so that the spirit can move on.
right.
Except,
So,
except today, we're now selling those to other cultures
Okay.
who want them.
Is
Yeah.
that a mask or isn't that a whole figure?
Yeah, these are not masks. These are standing
But
figures.
there is a Malagan mask that is made, because we
Yes.
just saw.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. So the first part of the process of the Malagan ceremony is to destroy the deceased possessions. Then the clan member would go into hiding and then produce the sculpture.
He's
Okay.
the actual artist.
Yes,
Is the
the creator.
When does the
That's
mask
a law.
come? That's he.
Oh, okay. So these are being identified for one particular. These represent one person.
Okay.
So, but what you would often see is that there would be a community. So the sort of pinnacle of the Malagan ceremony would be to dedicate to multiple deceased people within that community. So that's what you're seeing here.
So all of these people have died.
Yes.
Got it. It's a group.
Yes. Yeah.
And when we saw in the museum, the taller figure in the mask, was the taller figure like one of these?
Right.
They-
Those are one of the funerary figures. Yes. So very similar to one
so
of
you
these.
You wouldn't necessarily create both for one.
Okay,
person.
so they would be destroyed, but what we see in museums today are ones that were sold. So it was considered to be, well, we might as well sell it and or give it away because it wasn't needed anymore. So after the Malagan ceremony, it was considered to there was no need for that sculpture in the community.
So how long then, what time frame are we looking at here between, okay, they destroyed the stuff, now they're making the sculpture, how long does it sit there and maybe presented and shown before Kaputski?
It would be a ceremony that would last a few days.
So the ceremony lasts a few days, and that would be up and shown to everybody for a few days and then.
Yeah, and then destroyed. Yeah, so after the ceremony, let me just get. So after the ceremony, let's see. Okay, so what Malagan means is to be like, to make an image, or to look like. Okay, so that's what Malagan is referring to. So it's a representation of that person. Now, the actual ceremony itself, some writers, anthropologists, have created this term called the theater of memory. So what happens to this object during the Malagan ceremony is that the audience members would remember this. They would be looking, they would be memorizing that figure, and that is part of the ceremony to help the deceased move to the next world. Okay, so the pinnacle of the ceremony is often referred to, and I think in the anthropologist world, the theater of memory. Okay, so this is where the objects are to be seen, they're to be memorized, and then after they're memorized, there's no need for them anymore.
You said the theater?
Theater, theater. Theater.
And now we're back to the stage, thus.
This is where they would be displayed. Yeah.
Theater, stage.
Yes.
Drama.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
So they remember multiple people then for one ceremony, or do you have a ceremony every single time someone dies?
Yeah. And
People there.
right. So in this situation, and there may be other situations, but in this situation, there are multiple deceased members that are being celebrated. Okay. So also, the concept of Malagan is once the objects have been seen and remembered, they become empty, and thus they're not needed anymore. So I mean, when you're teaching your students, you have to just totally deconstruct, what visual manifestation means for a community. And I can't really think of any other example like this. There probably are, but it's considered ephemeral art. There probably are some examples. I don't know if they're.
So it's kind of like a visual eulogy.
Yeah. exactly. Yeah. So, and the final stage of the ceremony is considered to be, and I wrote down here too, just to kind of simplify it, destroy the possessions, create the carvings, Malagan ceremony, then that equates to finishing the dead. So again, a person dies, their properties are destroyed, the person goes into hiding to create the carvings, the Malagan ceremony happens to finish the dead so that they can move on.
And the body was buried a long time ago, right?
What's that?
The body was buried a long time ago.
Yes, yeah. That he could have died. He could have died years before. Yes.
And then,
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so just to give you guys some examples of what you see. Again, very individualized, depending on the clan, depending on their location. You might see some regional styles within northern New Ireland. And you saw on the map, New Ireland is not a big place. So we're talking about a pretty small vicinity. So you will find a lot of similarities, but very complex. Today we were so lucky to be able to see one up close and see all of the geometrical shapes that are in them. A bird on top is very common, on top of the head, which signifies death in New Ireland. This is another example of a bird on top of the head, and you can see the beak reaching down to the forehead. And again, I got a lot of these off of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so you might want to search, find some images.
I saw ones where birds kind of represent this thing that flies between earth and heaven.
Yeah.
They choose birds without using it because it's like maybe something that's going to
It will, yeah.
fly away. I don't know.
These ideas go back to, you might find some commonalities throughout cultures, but again, it's going to be really specific on like where the object comes from. So in this particular instance, birds signify death. Malagan also is a secret society. So to be very honest, we don't know enough about these things, and we probably never will because it's not shared, it's not considered appropriate to share with outsiders. But at least we can just see these different examples in complex forms. So the ones that we were looking at were the vertical forms, and again, using the composite figures in the sculptures, but also kind of dividing it, so we see kind of different sections that divide the sculpture visually.
Just to be clear, is Malagan referred to the people that live on the island of New Ireland?
Yeah,
Or is it
and
just the artwork?
Malagan is considered to be the ceremony. It's referring to ceremony, but you'll also hear Malagan culture, which is also referring to the communities that participate in the ceremony. What's that?
Just adhere to that tradition.
Right, exactly, yeah. Okay, I'm not going to go into this one. It's not on your image list, but just so you know, other funerary figures do exist. This is a chiefly figure, androgynous. We see a penis and also breasts. And these are not ephemeral. They're kept within a community and then reused to celebrate the dead. Okay, and then the mass. So again, we were able to look at one in the museum today, so we can see the crescent shape. And if you took a close look, you can see how detailed these are in terms of the different materials that are being used, the wood carving, and then the crescent shape of the head. These, you will see very similar examples when you're looking at different sculptures. So this is really a canon for the Malagan mask. This specific one is called Tatanua mask. Tatanua, Tatanua mask. Also part of the Malagan ceremony. But this is a mask that might be reused over and over again after the deceased after the final stage of the Malagan ceremony. Yeah, so these are generally meant to be seen by the public. So anyone can view these, whereas the Malagan sculptures are meant for particular community members to see. So these are kind of more of a meant to be seen within the public sphere. When you go to New Ireland today, you go to the different festivals, this is commonly displayed, commonly produced, commonly worn, and danced with.
I'm sorry, I got totally lost just then because I thought we were destroying these.
Oh no, so there's two different kinds. So this is the Tatanua. So this is the one, yes, this is also on your list.
So we have one that's not destroyed.
No, the other's on the list
Actually
too.
have both. We
But
have
both are on there.
this
It's
and
just
this.
if we can- yeah.
But one's destroyed and one's not.
Thank you.
So again, this is what's on your image list, and I think that what they might be trying to get at is the Malagan ceremony as a whole, but there's different variations, different components to the Malagan ceremony. So again, these are the sculptures that are destroyed, and this is the mask that is worn, reused, and carried on after the deceased have passed. Yeah, so it does represent the deceased, but again, it's not a representation of that person, but an embodiment of that person. Yes, so we could go into different ideas of canons. So, and I do have that in one of my comparisons as well. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so let's move on to the book mask. So this is image 218. And we're moving to the Torres Strait. So Papua New Guinea is up there. Australia is down here. And this is considered to be the Torres Strait, now politically owned and controlled by Australia. So a lot of different traditions have come out in terms of initiation ceremonies. And some of these mask traditions and initiation ceremonies are still being produced, and you see different variations of them. Okay, so this is the book mask. And it's made out of, let me just make sure. So it's made out of turtle shell. So we can see that the head is a turtle shell face. It's heated so that it can be molded into different forms. You can see that the sort of beard on here is carved with different shapes. And also it's capped with a frigate bird on top. And also it also has human hair on the side. And so this would be worn as a mask. Okay, so again, in Melanesia is primarily where we see the mask traditions. You won't necessarily see it in Polynesia or Micronesia.
When you said human hair, did you mean fibers meant to look like human hair?
No, I believe it's human hair. Yeah. Yeah. But good question. Okay, so now the earliest traditions that were recorded of the book mask go back to 17th and 19th century. 17th century, when the Spanish or the Portuguese first arrived, they have documentation of some of these mask traditions being used. and then also some of the explorers in the 1900s. Now, when the missionaries came, they banned many of these traditions. So up until that point, these were produced very commonly. But once the missionaries started to inhabit and sort of control these areas, the book mask was no longer used. So these masks were used for various purposes. They're really integral to religious life, to different life cycles. So you might see it in initiation, you might see it in harvesting festivals. So multiple types of life cycle events, these would be used. And when they were not being used, they would be kept in the quad, KWOD, which is the ceremonial house. So they would be stored there. This one in particular is representing the cultural hero Quoim, so KWOIM. And this cultural hero supposedly moved throughout the Trobriand Islands and conquered many territories. So in the Torres Strait, it's a very well-known figure. If we, so these are just more examples. This is the same mask. I got these images from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if you guys want to get more examples. And so you can see the different positions. So you see the frigate bird, and frigate bird is a common bird that you might see in Pacific imagery. And then we also see cassowary feathers on top.
Can you spell frigate bird?
Frigate.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's like frigate.
Yeah, frigate bird. Yeah. Okay. I just want to see what I'm doing. How am I doing on time?
Did you say the quad was a ceremonial house?
Yes. Quad.
Not a storage place, but things might.
Yes, that's right. Quoim. KWOIM is the cultural hero. Could somebody tell me what time it is? I just want to.
Quarter to 7.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh no. Okay, so we have 45 minutes. Okay.
Getting up at 5 a.m.
Okay, let's see how fast we can get through. Okay, so now this is an example of the leop, which you'd find in the eastern islands of Torres Strait. So within the same vicinity, but you can see how different they are. A little bit more naturalistic, but still a stylized face, just of a human. We can see that there's a beard tied on, and then the teeth also integrated in there. The use of the loep is not really known, but at least we can see these different styles that were developed in the regions. And again, a mask figure, so it would be worn on the mask.
Is the beard that turtle shell is carved?
Yes. Oh, the beard is actually hair.
No, I mean,
Oh.
The other one.
Oh. Oh yes. This is a carved turtle shell. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, and then this is just another detailed picture of the loep. Okay, so you can always just stop and do a comparison so that people make sure that it's registering it in their head, what's happening. So we have a mask figure from the Torres Strait made out of turtle shell, and then the Malagan. So a lot of differences between the two in terms of the way in which a figure, the canon, is developed. So sometimes it's good just to kind of do a cross comparison. We can see that the birds are incorporated on both of them, but the use is a little bit different, whereas the Malagan is very specific to a particular ceremony, whereas the The book mask might be used for various types of ceremony, funerary, but possibly initiation, and harvest festival as well.
What was that last one?
Harvest.
Is it used for life, births, and deaths as well?
Yes.
For life cycles?
Okay, so the next image that we're looking at is Nan Madol. And this is actually one of the only architectural images that you have on the list, which is a little bit surprising. So this particular site goes back to the Saudelair dynasty that exists from 700 to 1600 CE. So to begin, and to begin, I'll show you the map. So we're in Micronesia. So you can see how small these different islands are. And I'm sorry, this actually should not be circled. Pompeii is where we're looking at right now. Okay, let's see if this works. Yeah.
How far is that from another island? Just for context.
Oh, I'll show you in another image. Yeah, I'll show you in one minute. Okay, so I just wanted to give like an aerial view of this. In my classes, I do a lot of video just to kind of give people a little bit more understanding, because otherwise you just see the rock. So this is on a lagoon, and in the lagoon are islets. So, and in the islets are different ceremonial sections. So you can see just the coastal region, very forested, and then these basalt rocks that are incorporated. So again, different waterways. So canoes would be used to travel between the different sites. And what remains are basically these basalt walled areas. And I'll go into detail about how these are constructed, but just so you kind of have an overall sense of.
Are the waterways natural or man-made?
Yeah, so it's a lagoon. So they would be both natural, and then also with the basalt, it creates more of a foundation. So yeah, so it would be kind of both man-made and then also just the natural lagoon landscape. So it's a shallow lagoon. There are, in this site, there's 92 natural and artificial islets that are all specific to different activities. And to navigate between all of the different sections, you would have to do it by canoe. This is a map that is drawn out that traces all of the different sites. There's 3 main sites that we're going to be looking at. Not a lot left in terms of what the structures actually look like, but there's models of that have been drawn that are sort of guessing in terms of what it might have looked like. Yes, Cheryl?
You said it's a lagoon, as though it's a specific kind of thing. Is a lagoon something that's surrounded by reefs? Is it something that waves don't crash on?
Yeah, so it's a shallow water coastal area. So it would need to be, are you asking in terms of the structure?
Yeah, I'm just because I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. So it's basically a shallow watered area that,
You could
and
walk
then
up to
it,
here in water.
right, yeah,
All the way for like miles.
right, yeah,
That's with low tide. and
Yeah.
Then it's wrapped.
right.
And then
Yeah.
at low tide, it's just dry.
No, it's always watered.
It's always water.
Yeah, yeah. But there might be a high tide, low tide in terms of accessing some of the
And
points.
this basalt structures, they have been built out of the
They have been carried. The basalt stones have been carried, which I will discuss. So this is an example of one of the walls. So huge basalt stones that have been carried from inland and also from coastal areas. So they traveled a very significant distance in order to build this, very heavy. A huge amount of organization would have been needed to actually build this. The main structure and architectural technique is the header and stretcher. And so basically, you have the header, which is the diagonal large basalt stone, with the stretcher.
Horizontal.
Oh, what did I say?
Diagonal.
Sorry, diagonal. Oh, sorry, horizontal, yes. Sorry, horizontal. And then these smaller columns that are integrated perpendicular. So sort of sandwiched in there. So generally it is referred to as the header and stretcher. So 80 acres, all used for political and religious purposes, and a large seawall. So when the tide would be higher or lower, there would be a storm, this wall would protect these different ceremonial centers. So this is just an example. You can see a guy sitting down there just to kind of give an understanding of how tall it is. Okay, so inside the structures, you would see stone paving. Today, you would see stone pavings, platforms, and just the foundations of where the houses would have been built. And also in some of the pictures, you'll see just large rocks that were used to pound the sakau, which is a root that would be used for ceremonial purposes. So this is a reconstructed map of what one of the sites might have looked like. So a foundation, you can see the walls, the different basalt platforms, and then houses on top, different ceremonial houses, as well as residential areas. So the Ida Islet, which is here, was one of the main religious centers for agricultural reasons, and also it housed the great saltwater eel, which was a spiritual figure that basically resided in that particular center. This center also produced coconut oil that would be used for ceremonial purposes, and only priests would be able to produce this coconut oil. So this is one of the main centers that has been documented and historicized by archaeologists.
So it was entirely ceremonial, or was it also residential?
So that particular center was ceremonial,
Okay.
but there is a resident hall that we'll also look at. And this one in particular. So this is considered to be one of the most impressive Nan Dawas, which is right up here. So this section. And so again, when you go there today, you might just see these black basalt rocks. But this particular site is a site of the royal tomb. And so the tomb was dug underground, and today you can still actually go underneath inside the tomb. And really impressive walls that were built around it for protective reasons. So about 8 meters high would be some of the walls, and to 4 and 10 meters high. So various height and thicknesses depending on where the wall was and what the purpose of the wall was. Also,
So this is on one of the platforms or whatever?
yeah, so I know it's hard to imagine, especially when we're looking at these images, what it actually is. But again, these are the remains of these sites. So this is what we have left in terms of what actually existed. This particular site is on the east-west axis, and we'll see that a lot in different funerary tombs where they're oriented on the east-west axis. Okay, and then just another site, and just to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of activities that were happening in these sites. So this one was the resident of Saudeleur, who was the ruling king at the time, and his family and visitors would be allowed to, his immediate family and visitors would be allowed to actually reside in this space. Okay, so one of the points that I think is important in terms of explaining to your students about ritual spaces in the Pacific are these structures. And let's see. So your book, or I'm sorry, our list doesn't go over different structures, but this is a really common ceremonial house that would be in Micronesia, for example. So again, in those reconstructions, we saw the point of the house that tips up. So reaching up to the heavens. And then also common would be at the doorway, a fertility figure. This particular instance, it is painted on the top of the house. But often, in earlier examples, we would see carvings of the fertility figure. And you can see that she has her legs sprawled out. And every time a person would enter the house and then exit the house, they would be reborn. So a really common notion that we see in Melanesia and Micronesia is that the inside of a ceremonial house is the womb. And on the doorway, you would see a fertility figure, or a figure of a woman, a goddess possibly, that ceremonially or symbolically, when a person exits that house, they are being reborn. So thinking about space and ritual structures, this is another example in New Zealand, and also just to give you guys an idea of these ritual spaces. The marae is considered to be the house of the body of an ancestor. So when you're inside the house, you're literally inside the body of one of your ancestors. So each one of these poles represents a rib, and many different symbols that are incorporated. I'm not going to go into detail because we don't have a huge amount of time, but important, and that we can't really get out of Nan Madol because the archaeological evidence is sort of missing. But the importance of space in ritual. Okay, so one way of thinking about space, and this will help us kind of move on to our other images, is that art reflects concepts of the layout of horizontal and vertical space, and how objects are placed in it, or how one moves in it. Okay, so this is a pretty big concept. So when we're talking about vertical space, we would be talking about spaces of the heavens, the heaven, the earth, and different spaces that might inhabit this kind of verticality. So a house, for example, or ceremonial house, would represent a vertical space. A horizontal space would be migration, would be the sea, would be land, and these sort of understandings. So two different concepts that that we kind of need to grasp in order to really understand some of these spaces. So this is a fale. So we looked at the kava bowl, right? And so I had told you that the inside of the kava bowl replicates the roof of a fale. So this is just a general concept of this idea of vertical space. So vertical space in Polynesians' understanding would be like a coconut shell with several layers, the underworld, the ocean, the land, the sky. And when we move through different islands, you'll see that this kind of layered concept of space is understood in different ways, and different gods inhabit them. Okay, so what is happening in this image, for instance, is that the fale is designating that vertical space, right? So it's designating that space as a ritual space where these different gods can reside. Does that make sense?
Fale is F-A-L-E?
F-A-L-E, yes, that's correct.
And it's only like a temple, it's only a sacred space for the gods, it's not a house?
Fale would have different purposes, but in general, a ceremonial fale would be designated for men.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so now when we're thinking about horizontal space, this is when we can start thinking about another image that is on your list, which are these navigation charts, these Micronesian navigation charts. And I'll pull up the next slide that gives you that number. So the sea is filled with hundreds of islands. Tupaya, who is a navigator, a Maori navigator and priest, was one of the first to join Captain Cook, who was a very famous voyager in the Pacific Islands. And he recorded the location of 74 islands which were localized, and the directions of the winds that would blow to allow voyagers to get to these particular positions. And so this is just to kind of introduce this concept of voyaging. So when we look at a map, when I pull up some of those maps, we can understand that as relational space, as what's the word I want? Not relational, but we can understand the space, the physical space of that. But what's happening here is something that's a little bit more abstract. So in a navigation chart, we wouldn't necessarily be able to read it like a map. And I'm going to go into details about that next. But to introduce Micronesia, this region, let me see if I have a map. Okay, here we go. So Micronesia again. So we just moved from Papua New Guinea, Melanesia, and we're looking at Micronesia, where, yeah, and Pohnpei is also in Micronesia, in this area, a very small island. And then we're also looking at the navigation charts, which are also coming from the Marshall Islands. So in your content list, you have two images that are from Micronesia. Okay, so the navigation charts. There's different styles of the navigation charts. This particular one is called Meadow. And it's a piloting instruction. So you might have navigation charts that map the islands, that show all of the Marshall Islands or a particular region within the Marshall Islands. Or you might have a navigation chart that instructs navigators how to get from one point to another. And again, the way that we can read this image, well, actually we can't, because it is meant to be passed on to another generation. So, but what we do know about these is that they're illustrating, this one in particular is illustrating the location of different groups within the Marshall Islands. So when we see these curved sticks, those are the currents. When we see these pieces of coral, and I'm sorry this big blotch is there. So we have two pieces of coral. The currents, yeah. So it would be shell, I'm sorry, these are actually shell. So it would be coral or shell, but in this instance, we're seeing shell.
Did you say they were the islands?
Yes, those are representing the islands. And so for a navigator, they could be able to understand the currents in the wind through reading this chart. This is another example of Matang. So this is another type of navigation chart. But this one in particular is a little bit more intricate in terms of what it's trying to instruct. So it has specific instructions based on the wind, based on the sun, based on the moon, on the stars, that is instructing a navigator on how to get from point A to point B. So they're very, very complex in terms of the way that the swells and the currents are being depicted. So again, we can see the curved lines, which are the ocean swells, and how it's being deflected from an island. So the movement of the current juxtaposed to the actual island. And then where we see these lines meet with the horizontal is regarded as these points of collision with the current. So if a voyager is lost, for example, they might go to this chart and be able to find where that missing voyager is. And then just to kind of show the diversity, so these straight strips are showing where the current where the current direction of the ocean is. So we can see that in the short strips. So again, following the currents of the ocean. Recently on National Geographic's, there was this article about the dying wishes of one of the last remaining Micronesian master navigators. So this knowledge is still living, it's still breathing, but again, at the same time, with new technologies, it is also sort of diminishing. Navigation is secret knowledge that is controlled by men, that is passed down genealogically to the new generations. In the Caroline Islands, just as an example to show the complexities of these wind and water currents, there's 32 directions that they have named and also can be tied to origin stories. So the complexities of their knowledge of the pathways between islands is incredibly intricate. And I put another navigation story on there. The origin of Bilao is traced by a hungry boy who is tied up, set on fire. In his struggle, his body fragments into more than 300 pieces that would form the islands of Bilao. So again, the connection with the ocean, with the land, with the islands is tied to these mythological stories. Okay, so we are moving on, and we're going to look at a few different examples of staff gods. This one in particular is from Rarotonga. And just to give you guys an idea of where Rarotonga is, it is part of the island group called the Cook Islands. So pretty close to New Zealand. The Cook Islands is situated in the middle of the Pacific. It was settled in 800 to 1000 CE. And 1773, Captain Cook landed in this region. And within our historical kind of understandings, this is really important because a lot changes during this time. So when the missionaries came in, primarily in 1821 and 1827, this is when we start seeing the devotion to some of these gods and these figures disappear from this point on. So we're looking at sort of the mid-19th century when some of the last sculptures were actually produced. So currently today, just so you guys kind of understand current politics, it is administered by New Zealand. So a lot of connections between New Zealand and the Cook Islands. Now, when the missionaries took these idols away and prohibited these traditions to be made, it didn't necessarily mean the culture went away. So one of the recent conferences that I went to was actually in the Cook Islands, and we were talking specifically about about this figure, and I'll show you, but they're showing the head of the figure. There were different art historians that were explaining what the figure meant. And in the background, there was a few Cook Islander elders who were there. And they stood up in the middle of the conference and said, "You're trying to figure all this out, but why don't you come and ask us? We still believe in these, we still communicate, this is part of our oral history. You may have taken away our gods, but they're still very much ingrained in our communities today." It was a really powerful moment to see that. So when we're looking at these, there's a lot of complexities, social complexities that we could really talk about in terms of their histories. Okay, so what is happening with this one is, this is a staff god called Atua Rakau. So this is up here, Atua Rakau, from Rarotonga Cook Islands. They were made between 18th and 19th century, the ones that have been located. This example that we're looking at is the best surviving example. So we can see that it is, there's a central wood staff in the middle, and it's wrapped with tapa, many layers of tapa. I'm going to show you a few contextual images so you can kind of understand the image a bit more. So what we see here is a head, and we're going to take a detailed look of this head, and then at the end is also another penis that is sticking at the end, which often were removed from the missionaries. Considered it inappropriate, and so many of them were removed, but you can see here it's still in place. These were considered to be a god stick, and so we'll go into detail about what this consists of. Okay, your image list also includes this contextual image of Reverend John Williams, who observed many of these objects being carried. So in this picture, you can see a community of people, and then the different missionaries with multiple gods on the bottom. Now, these are great to have because they give us a lot of information, but at the same time, we don't know how truthful it is. We don't know exactly. This is a rendition of what's happening. But what is helpful for us is that we can see how many figures they were. So these were very common figures. And they would be carried upright and then also displayed. So in the back, you can also see one that's standing upright. So possibly displayed outside and worshipped as a god.
So,
yes?
Okay, I was just to say, how big are
Okay,
they?
good. Good question. Okay, so this is an image from the British Museum, and these are conservators working on it. So you can see how big it is. It's very, very large. And you can also see, although this image is a little dark, what's that? Okay, good question. We're going to get into that. That's going to be one of our next images. So tapa is a bark cloth. So it is the inner bark of a tree, a soft tree, that is then pounded down into a textile. And we see it all across the Pacific, other cultures as well, in Africa and possibly in South America. This is a common textile that would be produced. And then you can see that there's designs on it too, but I'm going to go into detail about some of the production of tapa. So you can see very thick layers that are wrapped around the god.
Is that, is the wrapping itself, it must be very significant
Yeah.
since they did it.
Yes, okay. So this wrapping is, it's a tradition that is a very important tradition in Polynesia. So wrapping the body, so this is the body of the god. This is the head of the god. The body is considered, well, the head is the most sacred. This is where the mana, the power, is carried. The body is also sacred because this is where it controls fertility, reproduction. And so what we see very commonly is that when gods are presented, it's inappropriate for them to be seen completely nude, although we're going to see many examples where they're not covered. So this is just an example of where the process of wrapping is very, very important. It maintains and holds the mana, the power of that object, of that god. So it's a really good example of where we see a really extreme example of wrapping. I mean, there must be many, many layers that are wrapping this god. Okay, so the head of it is also a really interesting thing to look at. Although it looks very small on the actual figure, it's about, it's probably about 2 feet tall. So it's quite large. You can see that the head is about 1/3 of the sculpture. So very large head, very large eyes, and then replicas, smaller replicas, that are possibly indicating the genealogical tie. So this has been identified as one of the creation gods, Tangaroa. That's Tanaroa, and possibly the children of Tangaroa. Tangaroa. And in this figure, you can see that there are some that are frontal and that some are profile. And there's different ideas of why that may be, and maybe indicating the presence of female versus male. But the profile figures have been identified as male for sure. And possibly the frontal figures by one curator has been identified as female figures giving birth. So again, this spinal cord that is connecting genealogy of Tangaroa. And then you can see how flat it is as well. The thickness of it. So it's probably about, I would say 4 inches thick. Yeah. Okay, and then just to give another example of a Tangaroa figure that also comes from the Cook Islands, you can see a lot of similarities. The big eyes, a head that encompasses about 1/3 of the body. So this is a canon that would be used within the Cook Islands to represent the gods. That is distinguishable to the Cook Islands. And we'll see how that begins to evolve. We can also pay attention to this idea of the profile, geometrical shapes that are indicating the eyes. And as we move on, we'll see that these this type of style, these types of motifs, are also incorporated in other art forms. So we might see it in Tapa designs, or we might see it in architectural ornaments. It's also connected to another god, A'a, from the Austral Islands. And just to kind of give you an example of this concept of imagining the gods. So it's one large figure, and then smaller figures carved on the exterior. And then in the inside, so this is a container, would be sculpted wooden figures replicating the god as well inside. So we can connect the idea of a container also with this idea of wrapping that we saw. So protecting the mana of what is inside. And to also give an example of gods that you might see in Hawaii, Ku, he's the god of war, but a totally different stance in terms of his fierceness, the open mouth. So you can see how the styles begin to evolve. Okay, this is another image on your list, 217. This is a female deity, Nuku'ora, Micronesia. Now, we are looking at Micronesia again, which is here. But the interesting thing about this Nuku'ora image is really that it's on the borderline, on the fringe of shared traditions throughout the Pacific. So we can connect some of the traditions that are coming from Micronesia, that are coming from Melanesia, and that are also coming from Polynesia. So this would be placed in a central temple that would be adorned with foods, flower, ornaments, part of religious ceremonies. And so placing an idol inside of a structure is a Melanesian concept. So as we move towards Polynesia cultures and traditions, you'll see that the gods are placed outside. So this is replicating, or it is imaging a god that would be part of important ceremonial events in Nuku'ora. And the style itself is particularly tied to Polynesia. So if we look at this figure, it's very simple. So in Micronesia, what we see often is a very simple design. Whereas if we think back to the staff god from from the Cook Islands, it's a bit more complex. But we can see that there is no face. It's very geometrical. The breasts and genitals are indicated by the lines that are also replicating tattoo designs from this region. The shoulders are broad, long arms, short legs. And in this image here, you can see that the legs are very slightly bent. So it has ties to both Polynesia and Micronesia. It's representing the local god to Nuku'ora called Goddess of Kave. And again, would be worshipped and adorned with different foods and flowers. So now this kind of gives you a scope of some of the styles that we see. Yes?
I'm just noticing a dark color of the wood. Is
Yeah.
the wood really that dark? The mask we saw at the museum had
That's
this
a good
same.
question. Yeah, that's a
They
really,
almost
really
look
good
bronze.
question.
No, they just-
They do, yeah, they do. It's a really good question. I mean, we're dealing with replicas or reproductions of these images, so it's kind of hard to know without seeing the actual image, but I would call it like a medium brown. But I wanted to just draw your attention to these styles that are coming out. Again, all of these three are a Polynesian style. So if we think back to Melanesia, you remember how complex the images were. Once we get into Polynesia, it becomes much more simple and stratified. This particular image is from Tonga. And in Tonga, you see a lot of triangles, a heavy use of triangles that are indicating a stratified system. So you can see that the legs are bent which kind of gives it a triangular shape. You can see that the shoulders are also very rigid and broad, and then also the chin, which also has a triangular shape. So when we look at this one as well, we can see that there are some traditions that are being shared in terms of imagining and creating a canon for the god, but very distinguishable traits.
So the female figures, they're going to just decorate it? Do they pray to it?
Mm-hmm.
Is it in a special place?
Yes, so are you talking about the Nuka Ora? Yeah, so the Nuka Ora figure would be placed inside of a house and adorned during ceremonial events, life cycle.
Just a person's house, a
Ceremonial house. Ceremonial house. All these gods that we're looking at now would be associated with ceremonies,
Was there a reason
not
why
a
your
person's house.
buttocks were protruding?
Yeah,
so
so you're referring to, wait, this one. Okay, there. So again, this is adapting, and if we had another picture of that Tongan figure, you'd see that the butt is also protruding. So these are different regional styles associated with a godly stature, right, that are indicating that it is a god. So particular canons. And there are many examples of Nuka Ora that have slight variations, but they primarily, and some would be male, some would be female, but this is a really good example of a typical Nuka Ora figure. Okay, so the Moai. This is moving to the Eastern Islands, which is down here, now controlled by Peru, I believe, Peru. And these figures, so again, this is one of the last islands that is inhabited during the Lapita migration. So we're moving to some of the newest cultures, right? So in some ways, we can understand it as, let me first do this one, as some of the most refined forms. So as they're moving, cultures keep refining this form of the god. Now, what these are actually representing are more or less unknown, debated, but they probably are ancestral figures. The Moai in the island of Rapa Nui are capped with these pukoa, or the top knots. And you can see that on the top, so a cap. And coral would be inserted into the eyes so that the eyes are wide open. If we look at the situation, the body, we see that the head is still very large and that the body is a bit truncated in comparison. The arms, there's not a lot of attention to the arms, and there are no legs. There's two particular sites in the Easter Islands that give us two different examples of what they look like, and it may be the earlier style and then a later style, but these particular ones are on a platform. And then I'll just go back to this image, even though it's shadowed, but you can still see the silhouette and the structure of the form. So another site gives us an example without the top knots. So these ones are just the head, the figure. Again, these are situated on an east-west axis. So the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, but also during the spring and autumn equinox, the sun might reflect on the back side versus the front side. So the sun and the cycle of the sun is very important in terms of regenerating the life or the spirit of these objects. But again, what they are exactly representing is not necessarily known amongst historians at this point. So these sites in the Easter Islands, we see that some of the heads are being sort of in the process of being moved. You might see broken pieces. The current theory of the movement of these heads, because again, we're dealing with a very, very heavy volcanic rock that are being moved many, many miles. So they're carved out of the face of the rock or the face of the cliff, and then they're moved. So the current theory, and you might have seen something on National Geographic about these, because these are sort of commonly discussed. The current theory is that they were walked. So ropes, very, very strong ropes, were placed on the outside, and then they were slowly, moved back and forth.
Ropes on each side of it.
Yeah, and then walked to where they're trying to go. But if you're on this island, you'll see a lot of broken heads too. So possibly examples that were just unsuccessful in moving them. Okay, so again, just to bring up some points that you could discuss with your students in terms of comparing and contrasting. We can see the evolution of style, imagining these possibly ancestral figures, whereas we see a god. But a lot of attention to simplistic, broad shoulders. You could talk about the size of the heads in comparison to the bodies, and the ritual purpose of some of these.
Some of them look like just a head, some of them have a body. Is the head, or is the body buried in the ground?
Yeah, so there's different styles of what was created. So those particular ones, it's hard to tell in that picture, but there are examples where it's just the head. So it may be a regional style within the Eastern Islands, yeah.
So are there lots of Easter Islands? One Easter Island?
Oh, okay, so we're looking at, it's a good question. We're looking at Rapa Nui, which is one particular island.
And how many of these figures would there be on that one island?
That's a good question. I think that there have been, I would say, in the range of about 1,000.
And so these, because they're aligned on the east-west axis, are more or less regeneration.
Yes.
Which is not too hard to know.
But these are very different than the other ones that were also on the east-west axis, right?
Yes.
Are they on two different places on the island?
Oh, let's see. Oh, the ones with the top knots?
No, these are the top knots.
Oh yeah, the other ones. Oh, without the top knots. Yeah, so again, it could be tied to a period of production and a refinement of the style, or it could be a regional style.
Both on the east-west axis, wherever they are on the island.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Good. Yeah, and they're on the coastal. What's that?
The ones that were kind of just strewn around, they aren't particularly on any line.
Oh, yeah, so those ones were probably being moved, and they were unsuccessful in their move. Yeah.
Are they looking out at the ocean? Right?
Yes. Yeah. Facing towards the ocean. Again, we don't necessarily know. I mean, I think there's some theories, but it's, I mean, if it comes up with your students, you can tie it to a regional kind of aesthetic, a style in terms of imagining. But it's a good question, and unfortunately, not a huge amount is known. Okay, so we're moving into, how am I doing on time? We're out of time. Okay, so what would you guys like to do? I'm happy to just briefly go through these.
Hit the highlights, I guess.
Okay. Okay, so what we're mainly looking at is Tapa. So this is 219 Hiapo. And Hiapo is from Nui, which is in Polynesia as well. So if we look at the map, it is close to Tonga and Samoa. And so many shared traditions within this region. The production of tapa is very important. Today, the #1 producer of tapa is Tonga, the island of Tonga. And so there's different methods. So again, a mulberry tree, and depending on the region, it would be stripped and then pounded down. What these women are doing are, this is a very large kupesi, it's a stamp. So after the bark is produced, the textile is produced, be laid on this large kupesi or stamp and then rubbed. So they're in the process of making their kupesi. So they're going to be making their designs on here, be rubbed and then painted over. So there's different traditions of how it's actually made. And so you can see here the woman is painting over the designs after it's been stamped. This is an example of one of the kupesis as well. Okay, so many different regional styles are in your list. It's hiapo, and I'll go over some of the important things. But some of the earlier traditions of tapa, we can trace back to Lapita. So a lot of the designs that we might see on the ceramic Lapita examples, we'd also see in the tapa. Okay, so very typical are these square divisions, and then within the squares are the designs. And I'm just breezing through this so I can talk about some of the hiapo. This is a contemporary version of tapa. So you might see more figurative, representational kinds of imagery on there, and then also produced in contemporary art as well. This is made in 2015. But with our book, with our list, hiapo is what's listed. So this particular style is probably a shared tradition that was taught from Samoa and Tonga, which have the most prominent tapa productions. And it's really distinguishable in comparison to Samoa and Tonga because of this circular design. So we see that there's a center, a point that then has multiple circular designs that are radiating out. And then within that are different sections with geometrical patterns. You can also see on the outside are some naturalistic looking plants and vegetal type of imagery that's probably tied to regional plants that are in that region. Okay, so let's get to the use. Okay, so this is an example of a poncho, so worn. Okay, I'm going to talk about the use via this image. So the use of tapa is a very, very important thing. What we see happening here are women in a ceremony. They're greeting presentation of mats to Queen Elizabeth II, and they're carrying mats to greet Queen Elizabeth. They're also wearing tapa. So they're carrying mats. So these are woven mats. But tapa and woven mats are considered to be valuable gifts. So they're part, again, of life cycle events. So if somebody dies, if somebody's born, if somebody gets married, they're given a huge amount of tapa as an exchange. And a tradition that we would see throughout the Pacific, but here in Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, it's this exchange of mats that are really important.
But because it's a symbol of wealth, or because they actually use it for
okay, good.
Everyday whatever?
Okay, so they're considered to be heirlooms. Again, during weddings, funerals, and commemorative events. In Tonga, it's considered to be kaloa, which is a valuable object that is only made by women and that helps regenerate people and culture. Okay, so we might compare it to what we saw in Melanesia with the Malagan. This process helps regenerate culture and regenerate life. within Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji, it's this act of gifting these valuable objects.
So where would it be stored after? I get the idea of the action of giving.
Okay, okay, good.
But what would they do with it? If it means regeneration and it seems to be something that's highly valued, they have to put it someplace.
Okay, so they would be stored. Sometimes they might be, nowadays they're hung on walls, but often they would be stored. They would be brought out for particular events. They would be laid on the ground. What these women are doing is they're getting ready for a ceremony for Queen Salote, and they will bring this to the ceremony, and then the queen will walk on the tapa. So it's presenting sort of a sacred ground for somebody to walk. Okay, now what else would they be used for? This is another example. So very, very large. This takes many villages, many women to produce this. What else would they be used for? They would be worn. So again, the wrapping. This is where the tapa and mats are very important in terms of protecting. It's considered to be the skin, a protective skin. So the more layers you see, so in this instance, we can assume that these men have very high status because of the textiles that they're wearing, the mats that they're wearing. It gives them a protective skin. And just a couple more examples of this. And then more historical photos. So a chief in Fiji, and then also another example that was drawn during one of the voyages, and you can see how elaborate, how thick the skin is. And again, we can compare this to the staff god that also has the wrapped tapa around it to protect the mana, the power, the regenerative factors of a person. Tattoo also is very important that we can compare to a protective element. This is a Marquesan example, but also protecting the skin. In Papua New Guinea, also wrapping a bilum with the feathers that also add a protective element. Okay, so along this notion of wrapping is the ahu'ula. The ahu'ula is carries on this tradition of wrapping, but possibly in one of the most refined examples. So this is a feathered cape, and I'll show more examples in a couple of minutes. That would be designated for a li'i, or a chief in Hawaii. So this is in the kingdom of Hawaii, in Hawaii. And so the designs, we might see different types of designs, but often this crescent shape, symbols that would be passed down, genealogical connections. And it's meant to signify the status of a person. So as we're going deeper into Polynesia, we see the importance of stratification in society. So we didn't necessarily see this in Melanesia, where only a chief, only a li'i, only a person of very, very high status could wear this, that indicates their power within a community, but also protects their power at the same time. Did you have a question? No, okay. Okay, so these are a couple contextual images, how it would be worn. So you can see that he's wearing it as a cape. Also tatau, a tattoo that is on there. Different styles begin to emerge, but indicating his status. These are the different birds. Now, to make this, it is an incredibly intricate process and takes a very, very many years to produce one of these capes. These birds are generally high up in the forest. Many of them are extinct now, extinct, still common, declining, possibly extinct, possibly extinct. So as new foreign birds came in, the habitat began to change, and thus many of these birds have become extinct, and the tradition has also not become extinct but changed. So they're using different kinds of feathers now. But to get one of these feathers, they would have to travel all the way up into the mountains, and there were bird catchers who were designated just to get these feathers. They would not kill the birds, they would just get the feathers off and then bring it down. Different methods of tying. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the finer the weave, the more feathers could be placed on the cape. And these are different examples. If anybody goes to San Francisco in the next, are you going to go to the De Young Museum? There's a Featherwork show right now that's supposed to be, yeah, it's a really, really beautiful show. So these are actually images from that. But so the yellow feathers are supposedly the hardest to get. So if we think back to that bird, and there's only a few feathers on that bird. So you imagine how much work, how much time it would take to actually produce a cape like this. Different designs that we can see. For some reason the images are not working quite well. And then this is a replica. So it became very popular in Europe for this type of feathered cloak, and so it was replicated. And just to advertise that exhibit, the Young Museum. Okay.
Just really quickly,
yes.
Are they still being made today?
They are still being made. They would be produced for, like, there was one, I think it would depend on the circumstance, but there was one contemporary piece that was made recently and placed in the Kahala Hotel. So as a tradition, I think it would be produced. But more so what you see today are headbands. So very intricate headbands that would be placed on the hats. But more or less, there are definitely people who are still continuing the tradition of featherwork, but not necessarily in this kind of circumstance. Okay, so I think this is our last image. There's also that Michael Tuffrey. Is that on your image list?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go over that one as well too. So this image, there's a lot that we could say about this image. The particular person that it is representing, Tamati Vakanene, is a really important person in Maori history who has ties with the Waitangi Maori history. Oh yeah, so we're moving into New Zealand. But also we can pay attention to Gottfried Lindauer, who produced this image. He's a painter. He's a painter who became very well known in the 19th century for his portraitures. And he became really well esteemed for producing images that really showed a likeness with the chief, or whoever he was representing. So what I mean by that is, today when we're looking at the Maori canoe prow, you could see that these circular lines in them. So just as we see in here. But those lines are indicating a person's genealogy. You can read it as you read a book. You can identify where they come from. But as an outsider of that community, we are not able to read that. That looks like circles and swirls and repetitive designs. So a lot of different painters and sketchers would come in and draw images of people, but what they were drawing was not the truthfully how they looked. So really representative of how we see as outsiders from a culture that is very intricate like this. So Godfrey became very well known for many portraitures that he did throughout the region. And if I had time, I would show you this awesome video, but I don't think we have time. So in terms of talking about this image, you can talk about Tamati Vakanene as a person, as a leader, as a chief. You can also talk about the painter who produced it and what that means as an outsider producing these kinds of images and his role. But we can also look into detail about what's being represented. So a cloak. This chief is wearing a cloak. He also has a staff, and he has taumoko. If I had a bit more time, I would go into detail about the meanings of each of these. I can also, what I could do as well is I could forward a couple videos that explain some of these things.
That'd be great, and they could put them on the website. That'd be great.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that. The wonderful thing about New Zealand and Maori culture is that there's a lot of things that it's still being produced. A lot of Maori artists say that their ancestors were very contemporary. They were more contemporary than they are contemporary today. So these traditions are very much alive. There's a renaissance in the 1980s, so a lot of information is out in terms of the cultural significance of these things. This is just an example of that. Again, an example of taumoko, carving on the face. So it's an old tradition of tapping that is still used today as well. Tapping and carving out pieces of the face in order to make the markings. So equivalent. Oh yeah.
Oh, right there, thank you.
Taumoko. So a carver and a taumoko artist would carry the same role, and often carvers are taumoko artists. And then this is just an example of a contemporary artist, George Nuku, who is still producing a lot of that stuff. And again, you can see the similarities in terms of the thickness of the lines and the carving and textures. Okay, I'm going to skip through this. Okay, so I didn't see this on the website, but Michael Tuffrey, what I'm going to do for this one as well is there's a video via Tapa Museum that I'll send it to you. But what is really important about this particular image, Michael Tuffrey is a very well-known Pacific Island artist, Cook Islander, and I actually can't remember his genealogy, but from, I think, Tahiti. He comes from various places in the Pacific. But this is a very important commentary on contemporary Pacific issues. It's a bowl that is made out of corned beef cans. So in the process of being colonized, many resources were taken away, land was taken away. And today, many Pacific Islanders are sort of eating out of the can. So instead of picking their coconuts from the trees or slaughtering their own meat, they're going to the store and buying it. And so he has a very important commentary in terms of capitalism, in terms of consumerism, and contemporary issues in the Pacific that are going on today.
And the corned beef was given as gifts.
Oh yes, yeah. So so again, sort of these contemporary things that are exchanged today. So in a ceremony, if you go to some of the Pacific Islands, you go to a birthday, you might see piles of tapa, and then you also might see piles of corned beef. So it's sort of supplementing, it's being sort of integrated into this idea of exchange. So new materials. And again, I think going back to that idea about the Cook Island god, staff god, and how that physical object was taken away, but the traditions are not taken away. So a lot can be said in terms of this knowledge production. New materials, but the knowledge and the culture is still very much maintained. Okay, I think I've gone way over. I'm very happy to answer questions, but I know that I've gone over too much.
Mostly thank you.
Yes.
Very sharing.
Oh, thank you.
With that